why is this economy frozen all of a sudden? Why are people paralyzed? Businesses aren't hiring, they're not spending, individuals aren't spending much. Everyone, I think, is frozen in place because of the fiscal cliff. It's a story that is maddening to see that politicians in both parties are nervous about the election. They're nervous about the fiscal cliff, but they have no inclination whatsoever to do anything about it. They just left town for a 5-week vacation. They come back after Labor Day, and between that day when they come back and Election Day, they have 13 legislative days. That's it, to get all of these things done. They still haven't passed a bill to keep the government open after October 1. They have to pass a bill to keep the post office afloat. They have to pass something on drought relief after the worst drought we've had in several decades. So it's extremely unlikely, as we move into a look at the fiscal cliff, it's extremely unlikely that anything will get done until after the election. After the election, they're back for a couple of days, and then there's the Thanksgiving break. So they really don't start until December 1 to focus on some enormous issues that affect every single person in this room, and I would argue has already slowed the economy. A failure to act in December, I think, could lead the economy into a pretty steep recession. So let's go through what has to be done, because I'm sure you all hear fiscal cliff, what does that really mean? Well, there are several things that have to be done, one would hope, by the end of the year. One is the so-called doc fix. The doctors have to get their annual Medicare payment increase. I think that's fairly easy. Another one that I think they can do by the end of the year is the so-called extenders, tax extenders, a provision keeping millions of Americans out of the AMT, which, like probably many in this room, I hate the AMT. I think I've bought the Army a tank over the last few years because of the AMT. They probably can fix that. They can probably do the extenders. Then you get into the really heavy lifting. 3 enormous issues that really are at the core of the fiscal cliff. The first is, and people have forgotten about this, after this debacle we had almost exactly a year ago with the threat of a government default, the credit rating downgrade, well, they extended the debt ceiling, but it's going to expire in December of this year. So we have to go through this all over again to get the debt ceiling raised by another $1.5 trillion. And there's a lot of people in the House, many Tea Party types who will get reelected in November, we'll get to that in a minute, who are going to be reluctant to raise the debt ceiling. So I'm out on a limb with a fearless forecast on the debt ceiling. I think there's a decent chance that Obama, whether he's reelected or not, will just extend it by executive authority. He's been doing that a lot lately. He's been using executive authority on a wide range of issues. Bill Clinton last summer urged him to do it. Clinton said, just raise the debt ceiling, and then, I dare you to sue me. Maybe he will. Maybe that will be one way to get us out of the debt ceiling problem. It will invite litigation, but it would get us out of the debt ceiling problem in December. That still leaves 2 enormous issues to be reconciled. One, of course, is what we call sequestration. In English, what that means is, since this deficit super committee failed last November, they couldn't get their act together. That was a pretty easy call. They are now talking about mandating cuts beginning in January, on January 2nd, of about $53 billion on defense, about $53 billion on domestic discretionary spending that would be automatic across the board. Well, I've talked to enough people in both houses to think there's no way in the world that defense is going to take a sequester of that magnitude. The Republicans don't like it, most Democrats don't like it. The issue, of course, like everything else, is how do you pay for it? If you exempt $53 billion, you've got to come up with offsetting money, and that's where everything bogs down in Washington. The Republicans want to cut social spending. The Democrats and Harry Reid want to raise taxes. So that theological dispute will continue over how you get defense off the hook. My guess is they'll let defense off the hook, and they won't pay for it. There's also discretionary domestic spending that would be cut as well. They have to deal with that, too, during the month of December. And I'll get in a couple of minutes to what I think is going to happen. But the biggest issue of all, the one that we all have to start focusing on, is that on the 31st of December at midnight, all the Bush tax cuts expire. That means the top rate goes from 35% now back to the old top rate of 39.6. That means that the capital gains rate goes from 15 back to the old rate of 20, plus 3.8% for some wealthy people because the Obama Health Care Act was upheld by the Supreme Court, and people forget this. There's an extra 3.8% on capital gains. And perhaps most ominously, if nothing is done by December 31st, the dividend tax goes from 15% to ordinary income, which would be 39.6% plus 3.8. That's a huge hike in the dividend tax and would be, I think, devastating for stocks that rely on high dividends. There's all sorts of other provisions. I won't depress everybody. I mean, the one that does stand out is that on the estate tax, the exemption would go from $5 million now back to the old exemption of $1 million. Many other provisions would kick in if we don't extend the Bush tax cuts. So what's going to happen? My guess, and I've talked to enough people on the Hill, is that they will do what Washington always does, and that is take the path of least resistance and kick the can down the road into 2013 before a final resolution. Isn't this great if you're an investor or you're a business and they're going to, well, we're going to kick the can down the road. Romney has said if he's elected, he would prefer Congress not do anything in December, so right after his inauguration, which would be January 20th, he would move very quickly to reinstate the Bush tax cuts if they lapse on Jan 1, to do a lot that I think could get through Congress pretty quickly. If Obama wins, I'm convinced he wants one of these grand compromises. He wants something that fell apart with he and Boehner last summer, that fell apart when Simpson-Bowles came up with their plan. This grand compromise would have a big chunk of revenue raisers, a big chunk of tax increases. And I tell all my clients and all my friends who love Simpson-Bowles, and Alan Simpson's a great guy, he's very funny, I like him a lot, you're never going to get that through the House. The idea that Boehner and Cantor would agree to a big tax increase is ludicrous. It's not going to happen.